Appreciate that. I wonder if you've ever built something. It's that time of year, isn't it? We build sandcastles. I'm not sure how invested the Lord is in the building of sandcastles. But there's a natural kind of, I think, a human, not just a male, but a human tendency to want to build things. And I couldn't get away from this psalm. I've been wrestling with it for a while, and so I thought I'd do some of my wrestling publicly and turn it into a spectator sport as we grapple with the scripture. You never know what might happen. This psalm is got so many layers of meaning to it that what I want to do today is just unwrap it a little bit, hopefully give you a thirst to go and do a little bit more with it. But I do want us to just dive in a little bit and just see what this psalm is really all about and what it might say to us today as 21st century people seeking to live lives that are fully devoted to Jesus, what that might look like. So that's my hope. At the end, when we're over coffee, if I did a little bit of that, come and say, well done. If I didn't, well, you know, enjoy your coffee. And the first thing I want us to see in this psalm is, and I'm not criticizing Sue at all in this. If I had been invited to get up and read, I would have read it in exactly the same way. But the very astute among us will realize that Sue didn't actually start the reading in the right place. Did you spot it? Did anybody spot it? If you've got your Bibles handy, just open them up, and you have this. Psalm 127, a song of ascents of Solomon, unless the Lord builds the house. Isn't that interesting? Now, Sue, this is no criticism because you did exactly what I wanted, and I really hoped that you wouldn't say a song of ascents of Solomon because it gets me to do this bit, you see. So I'm really glad. It wasn't a trap and it was nothing like that, but we would always read that. I would always read it from there. But it gives us some interesting context. Some of the Psalms, many of the Psalms are written by David. Some of the ones we don't have an attribution to, we think they may have been David. Those Psalms tend to be, God, you've been really good to me, smash my enemies. Those are those Psalms. They tend to be David. And then you have these Psalms of Korah and the sons of Korah, the Korathites, and they're ones that are often full of praise and worship. And if you're reading a psalm and it's like, how wonderful God is, let's worship him together, it's likely to be one of the sons of Korah. But here we have written by Solomon, and we know a little bit about Solomon, so just let's rehearse a few things about Solomon. Anybody tell me anything at all about Solomon? First fact, thank you. Thank you. He was a son of King David. King David had many sons, but Solomon was a key son of King David. One of the things that this psalm is about is at the beginning it says it's a psalm of ascent, a song of ascent. Does anybody know what these songs of ascent were when they were used? Somebody knows because they're smiling and nudging each other, so maybe the songs of ascent. Oh no, something else. A private joke maybe, but you can tell me later. Anybody know what the songs of ascent were? Oh, great, I get to share something new with some of you. So every year, several times a year, the people of God, Jewish people at this time, would gather together in, come on, you do know which city it was, tell me. Jerusalem, here we go, I'm just checking that you're awake. Jerusalem, and they would gather for the great festivals that they shared together. And the reason they went to Jerusalem was because that's where God lived. There was a structure there in Jerusalem that contained a place where his presence would be. This thing called the Ark of the Covenant that was surrounded, first of all, by a tabernacle that Moses had built when they wandered through the wilderness all that time. It was a tent that had a structure immediately around, special place where God's presence was, the very holy of holies. Not just anybody could go in, only a few people. Outside there was a court that other priests could go in and do stuff. Outside of that was a place where the Jewish people could come, and outside of that was a place where anybody could kind of gather. And so Moses, David built a tabernacle as well. He built this temporary structure in which was due to be located. So they gathered in Jerusalem for these big festivals because there you go if you want to get close to God. Like God had an address. Jerusalem J1 1AA. That was it, you know. You could go there, and so they would gather each year, a place where God was. And as they walked towards Jerusalem and they begin to go uphill, they would sing together these songs, and somebody would start one of these amazing songs. Somebody would just strike it. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, then everyone else would join in with the song. We were like those who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter. They'd sing these songs together as they were entering into the presence of God. And here's one of these songs that they would sing. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who labor, labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the building, the watchmen watch in vain. They'd remind themselves that as they're heading up towards the place where God is, it's a different kind of a place. God is at work and doing something in this place. So it's a song of ascent which sets the kind of tone. The focus was we're heading towards Jerusalem, the place where God was, and we're reminding ourselves of the good things that God's done. But then it's a psalm of Solomon. Thank you for reminding us that Solomon was David's son. David built this tabernacle for God, and he went all out in his worship for God. He put 4,500 staff members inside the tabernacle so that every day, 24/7, there was prayer and worship going on inside that place in the presence of God. Paid for the whole lot out of his incredible bounty, got through being quite a violent person, really, and subduing many territories. It was in David's heart that one day he would build a permanent structure in Jerusalem, that God's temple might be there. And as he began to talk to God about it, God said to him, no, there was a problem with David. And what the problem with David was, why he wouldn't be allowed to build the temple. Does anybody know? He had something on his hands. Blood. Too much blood on us. Those hands that had slain so many couldn't be the hands that built the Lord's temple. Why? Because unless the Lord builds the house. It raises all sorts of questions for us. This is some of the wrestling I've been doing as I've been reflecting on this particular psalm. Why it was Solomon and not David. Because David, for much of his life, appeared to be doing what the Lord had required. Sometimes we follow the Lord and others come after us and complete what we've done. Because it's not our building. Building is for people who follow after, and who follow after, and who follow after. So Solomon is the one that God said he could build the temple. And he did, and he built the temple. And he followed exactly the same pattern that David's tabernacle had been made on, which had followed the exact same pattern that Moses' tabernacle had been built on. And this will blow your minds if you don't know this already, but if you read the book of Hebrews tells us that all of those were copies of a heavenly blueprint. This is the stuff that I want you to wrestle with later, you see. Copies of a heavenly blueprint. What's happening there in the tabernacle somehow captures what it means to be people who have access to heaven, to heaven's throne. In Hebrews, we're reminded that Jesus made the way for us to come into the presence of God. And so this psalm perhaps becomes for us a psalm that's helpful too, as we focus on what it means to gather together and to come into the presence of God. It's a reminder that unless the Lord builds the house, we're laboring in vain. And so I wonder what it is you're building. I hear you might be building a part of your building sometime soon. Who knows? Maybe you're going to be building something in your home. Who knows? Maybe one day you'll be building a building elsewhere. Who knows? 2 weeks ago, my son, Hope's brother Nathaniel, who, how's this so scary? He's part of a YWAM team that lives and works in Kyiv. Absolutely. Thank you. I had pure blonde hair and a full head of hair. He's been there a year and this is what he's done to me. But you know, a couple of weeks ago, he was with a team of 15 people, doing something called a Wave of Hope. There's one in June and there's one a couple of weeks ago. And they're going into places where the Russians have been vanquished, they've been liberated, and Ukrainian families who are so proud of their land want to move straight back in and repopulate those areas. And so one of the things that this NGO that he works with, YWAM Youth with a Mission, was going into those areas and building homes. In June, they built 2 permanent structures and I think 18, 19 temporary homes. This time they went back and they painted one of those full-time buildings. Wonderfully emotive video of this lady who's returning and who had returned to rubble and the pictures of the rubble that were there. followed by the pictures of her receiving the keys to a new permanent house. It's incredible. It's incredible what we can build. And when we build in the Lord's way, all kinds of things are happening. It may be a physical structure, and for Solomon, it was a physical structure. He sought God and got God's guidance on everything that was being knitted together, on every stone. He was given clear instruction. No mortar used in this place. Every stone cut perfectly so they fit together. Why? Because this is for the Lord, and unless the Lord builds a house, you're laboring in vain. And so I want us to just reflect for a moment on what Paul says about buildings, because we are not Jewish people and we don't go to a temple. So in one sense, this has got nothing to say to us. Except in Ephesians chapter 2, Paul says that one of the things that Jesus was doing on the cross was demolishing all the walls of hostility that exist between people in order that God could, everybody to himself, recreate one new humanity. And this is the language Paul uses, knitting them together like living stones to create a temple in which God dwells by his Spirit. And all of a sudden, this psalm says something to us, right? It says something to us of what it means to be a community, of how we do our life together. It says something to us of how we must see God's inspiration and vision and guidance for everything we're doing with church families, but also a reminder that God is building something here too. That you and I are part of what God is doing here on the earth today, building temples in which he dwells by his Spirit. And as you gather together, there's something in that togetherness we as Baptists get hung up in a really positive way. We think that when we're together and we seek the mind of God, something can happen. A story for another time, but I became a Baptist because I fell in love with the idea of a church meeting. Find out over coffee. This idea that God might knit us together in such a way that we become a dwelling place for the Holy Spirit. Not just a place where he visits, but he dwells. How are we doing on the building? Because here's the thing, those stones that Solomon was using that were cut perfectly so they fit together, and those stones were chiseled and shaped. They had to choose the right stone for the right place. They had to make some stones that were really big, smaller, some that had rough edges, smoother, some that needed a notch cutting out, so key into something else a bit better. I guess I want to challenge you a little bit that if you as a living stone are exactly the same as you were whenever it was you came into the kingdom, I wonder if we've been allowing the Lord to do his work in our lives to shape us fully. Are we a stone that's still waiting in the brickyard, waiting to be picked up and brought in? Are we holding back from being part of the building, perhaps? I'm not going to push that metaphor much further because the building will fall down. But I want us to see here for us in our community life, in the way that we make decisions, in the way that we do our ministry, in the way that we talk to each other, in the way that we respond to each other, in the way that we forgive each other, in the way that we seek forgiveness from each other. Unless the Lord builds the house, we're laboring in vain. So God has a way of building that he wants to do. I want to just pause and just to reflect on what it might mean for us to build the Lord's way. And there are certain sections of the church that would then start to talk about a whole bunch of things, and we'll get. I want to make this really, really easy for you as a starting place. Look at everything Jesus taught. Look at everything Jesus taught. And that is the way that he builds. That reveals the way of God. How can you say such a thing? Well, Jesus once called some people idiots, right? You know this story. Maybe you've forgotten it because we talk about it a lot in Sunday school, and we teach it in Sunday school, and when we teach it in Sunday school, what we teach is true, but it's not quite what Jesus said. I'm talking about the story of two men who went to build homes. And one person built his house upon somebody? Rock, and the other one built on sand. And Jesus tells these two people, And we teach this in Sunday school, and we say, so Jesus taught that there was somebody who built a house on a rock and somebody who built a house on the sand. And when the rain came, and the rain came down and the floods went, the rain came down and the floods went. When that happened, Jesus tells us, the man who built his house on the sand, the house fell flat. I'm telling you, build your life on Jesus and you will have done it right. And that's true. Honestly, it's true. If you've ever taught a child that it's true, it's just not what Jesus actually said. This is what Jesus said. Anyone who hears these words of mine and then puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. But if any idiot hears these words of mine and doesn't put them into practice, they're like the kind of person that will build their house on sand. It's quite powerful, isn't it? Because Jesus said a lot of stuff. Jesus taught a lot of stuff. That I just read or spoke to you comes in Matthew chapter 7, a huge section of teaching. The Sermon on the Mount with all of its challenges, everything that is that Jesus ever taught. Jesus says, hear these words and put them into practice and you'll be like a wise builder. But if you hear these words of mine and don't put them into practice, then, these are Jesus' words, not mine. If it offends you, take it up with him. You're a fool. If the Lord builds the house, then we're not laboring in vain. And I'm not saying lots of big issues in the church. I generally don't. I just kind of am struck with this psalm and how much it speaks to us of what it means to be church today and what it means to be a Jesus follower today. Because we want to build something that lasts, right? And then this psalm does this really weird thing. Because we think we've got a handle on it. We think we know what it's all about. We think we've got it. I've had to understand how, in context for us, I could stop the sermon right now. That means that we've got time to pray together and bless together, coffee in 10 minutes. It'll be perfect, right? Except there's this step change that happens, this weird thing that goes on in the middle of the psalm. There he is. Solomon's talking about building the Lord's house, and if he builds it, it'll be great. I know he said if we build it, it will come, but that was a whole other thing. A movie that maybe some of you have seen. But instead, there's this little step change that happens. He's talking about building the temple of God or building the people of God as they gather together. And then he says, children are a heritage of the Lord. Hang on a minute, Solomon. Where does that come from? And he goes on to speak about the blessing of having children and how that is a sign of God's blessing from God. And they will defend you if the time comes when you need defending. Where does that come from, Solomon? It comes from Solomon's deep appreciation through the work of God that what he was building was not merely a building, but a legacy. And so it leads me to ask a question. What kind of a legacy are we leaving, you and I? I am 53, and I begin to think about legacy in a way that I didn't when I came into ministry 35 years ago. Yes, I was 17 when I first worked as an evangelist. Pastoring and leading churches and doing all kinds of other fun stuff for 35 years. And now I start to think thoughts of legacy. Now. And this psalm invites us to realize that we're not just building for the here and the now, for this moment. We're thinking about what we hand on to our children and the fact that we can hand something on to our children, whether they be our literal, biological children, or adopted children, people in our families, or whether they're the children in the Lord who come after us and pick up the work we're doing. The psalm invites us to reflect on the fact that those who follow us have a chance to be a blessing. If we can hand something on that is worth handing on, that they want to pick up and run with. There's a real challenge in that to me, a huge challenge. It asks me about how my family, it asks me about what kind of a legacy of worship and of prayer and of seeking God and of doing things that have an eternal impact. Perhaps it asks us as churches exactly the same question. What are we building right now, but what are we doing in terms of our legacy? What is it we're going to hand on to another generation they will continue the works of God. And in this psalm, it talks about them being able to speak up for us. In a sense, our children and those that we hand the heritage legacy onto, whatever we're building here, they'll be the ones that speak of us. I find that really challenging. So what do we have here? We have this psalm, but when we first look at it, is a psalm about the God's temple and how good it is to be there and how wonderful it is, and a reminder that we must focus on God's building. But then we realize that for us it means more than that. For us as followers of Jesus, we realize when Paul says that God is knitting us together to be a temple, that he dwells by his Spirit, that means that sometimes some bits of us need to get chipped off. Sometimes we need shoving up against somebody we might not like. Sometimes it means that we're in the right place at the right time, and we're the pretty one that stands on top and everybody goes, ah! And sometimes we're the one that's stuck at the bottom that nobody sees, but we're holding the whole thing up. And every stone is vitally important for that temple to be built. The psalm invites us to ask ourselves, what am I doing in terms of building the temple, in terms of building God's house here today? It invites us to reflect on, Jesus gave some really clear instruction on the kind of building we should be, the kind of people we should be. And if we follow Jesus' teaching, if you get through with the whole of Jesus' teaching, then you can move on to Paul, but, for a lifetime, to make that lot work. There's a lot of challenging stuff there. But if we build the way that Jesus built, with the values that Jesus builds on, just read things like the Sermon on the Mount and see the kind of love and generosity and care and welcome and all those amazing things. If we build that way, then maybe we build something that the next generation, our children, spiritual or physical, will pick up and run with, and will be something that speaks well of us for generations. Well, it's quite a short psalm, but there's a lot in there. And you can see what I've been wrestling with. And my gift for you is, you wrestle with it now. Yeah. Let that noodle away in your mind for the next few weeks. What does it mean to be a stone? What does it mean to hand something on? What does it mean to be part of what Jesus is building today? Things about this church. One of the things I didn't know how well you sang. That was an absolute delight. I go to some churches and I'm the one singing, which is kind of fine. I don't mind that, I'm not ashamed of my voice. I'm quite happy to use it, but I was drowned out today. It was great. Love that. And we're going to sing again a song that speaks of how we build, really, and what our hope and our trust is in. Not just some vague, I'm going to trust in God, but I'm going to look at Jesus. I'm going to look at the things he said, and I'm going to put them into practice. And as I do that, I'm going to be fit together with others doing the same thing to build a temple that God dwells in by his Spirit. Isn't that awesome? I mean, frankly, that's the reason I'm a Baptist, because I think that's what God calls us to do, and to be people who dwell together and that God dwells in the midst of. Let's sing together that great song.